Okay, I think we've given it enough time and we have a pretty decent participation here. Um, so I'm just going to start off by saying thank you everyone here for showing up to the forum, Ukraine and Bosnia, the future of multiculturalism in Europe. Given by the participation here and the attendance, I think that we can all understand this is a very pertinent topic to geopolitical situations and discussions. So to briefly give my reasoning for wanting to host this forum, I actually have Bosniak ancestry. So like many Bosniaks, I really hold the tragedies that took place 30 years ago pretty deeply in my heart. And it pains me to see similar things happen and similar tropes being applied throughout the world again and again and again. This time, Ukraine, and currently many other spots in the world right now. So that is really the motivation and the purpose of this forum. Now, to give a little bit of a brief introduction on the format of this forum. So we're gonna hear from our three speakers consecutively in a row. And then after that, we'll have a time for question and answers. Now, one thing to note is that for the questions, you'll have to type a direct message to me on the chat and we can ask it that way. And there won't be any time after or between the panelists to give questions. So just please save them to the end. And now our first speaker is going to be Orel. I believe you should be able to turn on your microphone and your video. I'll give a brief introduction of you, Orel, first. So Orel Beilinson is a historian of modern Eurasia at Yale University, where he is completing a doctoral dissertation on young adulthood in 20th century Europe. Orel is a comparative historian who works across Eurasian societies in the 19th and 20th centuries with a working proficiency in all major regional languages. He is currently a research fellow at the Open Society Archives in Budapest. And with that, I open it up to you, Orel.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I will start by saying when I received your email, I was not really sure that Bosnia and Ukraine have much in common. And I think that this will be how I will start my comments, because for me, as someone who began studying first Russian history and then branched out to Yugoslav history, the experience of coming to both countries was very different. Obviously, the first time I came to Bosnia, it was impossible to know that I'm actually speaking Serbian. And I think that despite all the things that have been said so far about how similar Serbo-Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin are, you could rather easily see if someone is speaking modern standardized Serbian, standardized Croatian, or standardized Bosnian. And the first thing that many people noticed when I came to Sarajevo was that I speak Serbian. I say hleb, I don't say kruh, I don't say hleb, etc. And this linguistic difference between my Serbian, which was to many of my interlocutors a choice, right? I was not born to this dialect, though it was not, let's say, a very thought out choice. It is a choice that I made. This is none of the awareness that I had when I first landed in Kyiv, which was after 2014. 2014 was the language that I began learning Russian in. But when I first entered Kyiv, I never thought twice about speaking Russian. I never thought that it was weird that I speak Russian, not Ukrainian. No one, by the way, from my colleagues who also came from American universities or Israeli universities spoke Ukrainian. And the first then, so when I received your emails, the first thing I began to contemplate on was how different my experiences of multiculturalism was in both Bosnia and Ukraine. When I first visited, it was not uncommon, for example, that, I went to a certain place, maybe a hotel or a restaurant, and the same young waiter, for example, would switch languages instantly to speak Ukrainian to my Ukrainian friends and to speak Russian to me, and no one really felt very odd about this, at least not in the way that I was, sometimes with no good reason, when I came to Bosnia. I didn't know anyone who come to Bosnia to study something that was not the genocide and the horrors of the 1990s, whereas I knew so many people who came to Ukraine to do something other than engage in inter-ethnic tensions. So when we started this conversation about the future of multiculturalism in Europe, the first thing that came to mind to me was how instant the change was, how amazingly brief the atmosphere and the discourse around my Ukrainian colleagues, friends, people I follow on Twitter and Facebook was not only, I guess, around 2014, around the illegal annexation of Crimea and the war in Eastern Ukraine, but I think much more rapidly, much more quickly than after February 24th, 2022. In a way that I would say the comparison to Bosnia would then make somewhat depressing, because when I came to Bosnia for the first time, almost everything that people had to show me among the locals was, let's say, the bleeding wounds that still bleed, right? When I first came to Bosnia, the first thing they wanted to show me was just like the first time when you go to Belgrade, they show you the building of the Ministry of Defense, where you can still see the NATO bombing. No one cleared that up intentionally. Today, the first thing that you come to see when you see Bosnia, and you want to see Bosnian society, they show you segregated schools, they show you divided families, they show you places where people lived and will not live more. But unfortunately, the other thing that that I got to recall when I started thinking about what I will say today is the discourse outside of Ukraine and Bosnia, in the place which I know best, which is my home country of Israel, where by the time that I came to Bosnia, I was prepared to speak about horrible things, because most people had this common history of so-called ethnic tensions in Bosnia, that then when I came back to Israel, I had to explain, no, they did not really hate each other for thousands of years. Whereas when I grew up in Israel and I was surrounded by both Russians and Ukrainians, the common joke in Israel was, I'm not Russian, I'm Ukrainian, because no one could tell the difference. Also because no one I knew who was from Ukraine either hated the Russians profusely or spoke Ukrainian. Most of the Ukrainians in Israel spoke Russian. And now you get really to see how the discourse immediately changes, not in Israel, that is, not in virtue of multiculturalism, but some kind of a eulogy to a multiculturalism that can never be again. So for example, I just heard recently some analysts from Israel saying, at least now the Ukrainian reality is going to change and Russia will not be able to invade once more, as if it was over already, because now all the Russian speakers will run away or will be Ukrainianized. That is, they will change completely to speak only Ukrainian. And now if Russia wants the Donbass or Crimea, they should have it, because now it's all Russian. And the comment there then about multiculturalism is how times of war like this make multiculturalism less likely, because they just reify national tensions. If before February 24th, so many of my friends from Ukraine would spend prolonged times in Russia, they would spend most of their academic careers working on topics that are of interest, not only to Polish colleagues, but also to Russian colleagues. Now, so many of them will never go back to Russia. And I'm not speaking here only on going to the country that occupied their country, the country that sent soldiers who killed children and killed civilians. But so many of them, I think one of the most frequent things I see now on Twitter, on Facebook, in Ukrainian and Russian is, we don't want to hear about Russian culture anymore. We don't want to hear about the glories of Russian ballet. We do not want to hear about, let's say, statues of Pushkin, which are in Ukraine. So I think that the main thing that now becomes clear to me is that when I came to Bosnia, I was ready to deal with national conflicts, with the impossibility or the fraughtness of tensions, even though to many of the local interlocutors, it has become in some way some kind of a tourist trap to introduce all of us to the difficulties of multiculturalism. Whereas now in Ukraine, it's really the first time that I'm able to grieve about a multicultural situation that most clearly, I think the discourse showed us throughout the war that there is a cultural aspect to it after all. I think that so many of us were willing or almost eager to kind of separate or bifurcate the war. It was Putin's war to begin with. It was the war that Russians would not commit on Ukrainians. It was a war that was one psychotic, unstable, history buff in the Kremlin wanted to commit. And now we really see that for better and worse, this would have immense effects years forward on coexisting, just because we saw here how much of this war, let's say, was made by a concrete choice of soldiers. The one thing that I would want to say to end my comments here is that multiculturalism is something we would have to look at when we go and recheck what's going on in Russia once the war ends. One of the few observations the data analysts seem to get from working with data, both the one leaked by the Ukrainian army, but also, let's say, by tracing the shameful transfer of looted goods through Belarus back to Russia, is that there is a crisis of, let's say, we can call this a horizontal culture or inner culture within Russia, between the so many soldiers who were sent to this war from Russia's non-ethnic Russian territories, from the Russian periphery, both socioeconomic and ethnic, they both overlap in many respects. And we see here, and I see this best also here when I sit in Hungary, a country whose support of Ukraine has been hesitated to be mild from the beginning, and then overall derisive once the elections here begin. We see here how the war in Ukraine also exposes the two cultures that exist in many of these societies, both in Russia with the maybe minority against the war that accepts either enthusiastically or not the alternative to democracy set forth by Putin, and in countries like Hungary, where the elections were fought as Orban, I say, Orban in Hungary said the best. The last 24 hours or week or so of the elections were fought over the war in Ukraine too. So I think that when we come to speak about the future of multiculturalism in Europe, we don't really speak only about the coexistence of different cultures in Ukraine, like in Bosnia, or different ethnic groups. We also see here a very strong bifurcation between people of the same nation, who will now have to face each other now and in the day after the war, not only as criminals in the case of Russian youth sent from various republics within Russia, but also in country which I know very well and have been living here for quite a while and will still come back here one after time after the other, in Hungary, where so many people were willing to support a regime that turns its back to Ukraine, and the others who really cannot believe that they live in the same country as the others. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Orel. And without further ado, we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Yevhenii Monastyrskyi, who's a historian and social scholar. At the moment, he's a graduate student in the European and Russian Studies at Yale University, and a European Studies graduate fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. He was also a research lead at War Childhood Museum, Ukraine, and a member of academic advisory board to the Ministry of Reintegration of Temporary Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Originally from Luhansk, he blends research on Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly the formation of Soviet ideological institutions, with social research on the effects of the Donbas War on citizens. In his hometown, he took part in the Russian-Ukrainian War of the spring to autumn of 2014, where the Russian armed forces and pro-Russian separatists kept him captive in June 2014. He studied at Ukrainian Catholic University, Lviv, after fleeing occupied Luhansk, was a visiting assistant in the research at Yale University, and a global dialogues fellow at the New School for Social Research in New York. And now I pass it off to Yevhenii.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for invitation. Not as I planned, but I wanted to actually shadow what Orel said. It reminded me of his Ukrainian example of his story. Our advisor, Marcy, sure likes to tell about people in Ukraine talking to each other simultaneously in Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, German, and perfectly understanding each other, and the situation all being very Ukrainian. This is something we are all lived through, and to be honest, in my family, as I'm coming from Eastern Ukraine, I'm speaking Russian with my Ukrainian mother and Russian with my Jewish father, though everybody perfectly understands Ukrainian well. I'm speaking Ukrainian with my partner. So this is something very normal in our circumstances. However, I'm not specialist in multiculturalism and culture per se. I'm, as I like to say, for the last couple of weeks, that's I'm the person whom Putin doesn't let to be a born scholar for second time in 8 years, because this was the general reason why I came back to academia. So I spent most part of my professional career in last years in fields studying the repercussions of war, and the thing which I like to call the ordinary people. So both as a social researcher for different governmental, non-governmental programs, and as a researcher for World Childhood Museum, which is actually a sister institution of the World Childhood Museum in Sarajevo, which is was actually first founded as just a research branch and then turned into a separate museum. Unfortunately, right now, in very dire circumstances, we're trying to save our archive. Yes, so as I said, since 2014, when Russian aggression against Ukraine began, leading to the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, I have been conducting, in collaboration with colleagues, a series of studies focusing on different groups of people affected by war. These include internally displaced persons, or IDPs, with their own strategies of migration and adaptation, people residing in the occupied territories, who are witnessing the transformation of their everyday lives, which is now even harder to trace, but thankfully some of the people are still there, and there's opportunity to build and update as we speak, and also residents of the so-called gray zone, the territory between two conflict parts, between on the line of contact, as it was before February 24th. And the problem with this group was that they were living beyond jurisdiction, well, there was situation where no one is responsible for the lives and well-beings of those people living there. In all of these cases, the focus for me was always on people whose life worlds were ruined and who found themselves in the extreme circumstances of war, forced migration, and other occupation. And So this is kind of study to quote unquote the average person's life in the under the extreme circumstances. So to be honest, before this stage of war, it was a relatively boring and prosperous field of studies because of the number of IDPs in Ukraine and a number of problems, but it also was a space where one can conduct very in-depth study of the transformation of the social order, because 1.5 million of internally displaced persons from Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast moved to other parts of the Ukraine, and though creating internal migration of the scale never seen in, well, probably since the end of the Second World War, and the whole adaptation in the new host communities was very interesting point to study, as well as actually COVID in those circumstances. And as for instance, museum and War Childhood Museum, the building of the archive there was probably the most important work I've been doing for the last 3 years, because we was going to the front lines and working with the children, those who've been 18 and younger at 2014. So basically, those who can be called the children of war, and their experiences being represented through in-depth interviews and through things they were bringing to us, telling the story of migration or staying or residing in the territories which were once occupied, but then was retaken by the Ukrainian army. And yeah, so and this was always an experience of well, as Orel mentioned, multilingualism, which was pretty widespread situation in also in Eastern Ukraine. Villages are usually Ukrainian speaking, and cities mostly Russian speaking. This is actually the truth of my family. The Ukrainian side of my family was Ukrainian speakers till early 50s, until my uncle and then my mom was born, and because the whole Stalinist situation, family decided to switch into Russian as more privileged language in the empire. Though this situation changed, and right now, for instance, my brother, who is in armed forces in Ukraine as we speak, and he's switching to Ukrainian, and studying, collecting the archive in the territories affected by war. It's always enriching, and it also was always creating the moment of reckoning of the conditions of life, which was always a punchline for me to bring as a historian, but also as a social scientist. That's this is my methodological punchline. That's history is a social science, and it's obliged to adopt methodology which allow to understand the conditions of life of the ordinary people on the ground. And since there was always an opportunity to build an work in archive, it's for now, for instance, for me, it seems like an obligation. It's still figuring for me as a scholar and as a grad student a great problem how to build on the situation where I'm trying to help my country, but I also worry about the experience of my people, and also worrying about creation from one side and archive of the experiences of the people who survived. For instance, even minor armed encounters from one side. From another side, it is also important for me to work with my friends who are documenting war crimes and crimes against humanity. So because of this, we're about to launch with a couple of my colleagues and Yale and a few other institutions in Ukraine and Europe, the documentation project, which will be going on in Europe among the refugees. And this would be probably another interesting thing for my colleagues, for my sociology colleagues in Ukrainians in Europe, who are already starting to study the adaptation of the Ukrainian refugees in the circumstances of other languages. And the most interesting cases are right now happening, for instance, in Poland. And I think Orel has some interesting stories to tell about Hungary, though Hungary is now is not actually loved now a country among Ukrainians for obvious reasons. Yeah, and I will probably end somewhere here because we come into the moment of with the Ukrainian refugees right now in Europe, and my another argument I've been talking about for I think about 5 or 4 years about the Ukrainians and Ukraine as integral part of the European Union and Europe as a historical concept. And one cannot imagine the European history without Ukraine as in its core. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yevhenii. And now we'll move on to our final speaker, who is Selma Porca. Selma Porca was born in Banja Luka, Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the aggression on Bosnia, Selma and her family became refugees. They spent most of the war in Sarajevo while it was under siege. In 1999, they emigrated to the United States, where she attended the University of Washington. She holds a bachelor's of business administration with a major in accounting and a master's of professional accounting with a major in tax. Selma's experience as a refugee contributed greatly to her community activism and her unwavering commitment to social responsibility. She has served and currently serves on boards of several nonprofit organizations. Selma worked in the public accounting sector for over a decade between PwC and Deloitte. Earlier this year, she decided to leave the public accounting world when she took in the position of the executive director at the Congress of Bosniaks of North America. And now I pass it over to Selma.
Thank you so much, Fawzaan, for the introduction and for providing a platform for us to discuss this very pertinent and imperative topic today. It's my privilege to be here to share one Bosniak's perspective. I want to start off by wishing all those observing Easter, Passover, and Ramadan happy holidays. As Fawzaan mentioned, my name is Selma, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congress of Bosniaks of North America, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization which seeks to articulate and represent Bosniak interests and promotes positive aspects of Bosniak cultural, historical, ethnic, and religious heritage in the United States and Canada. The Bosniak people understand better than most what Ukraine is going through today. We stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and many of our communities in the United States and all over Europe have organized protests to show their support to Ukraine and to democracy. As Fawzaan mentioned, I was born in Bosnia and came to the United States as a refugee after my family was forcefully expelled from Banja Luka for being Bosniak Muslim. We lived in a number of refugee camps and eventually ended up in Sarajevo, which was under siege. I entered the city through the Tunnel of Hope, which was the only way people and resources could get in and out of the city. The tunnel is now a museum and one of the symbols of Sarajevo's epic resistance. The photos and videos coming out of Ukraine bring back memories of Sarajevo under siege, except while Kiev is being provided with high-grade weapons to resist the Russian invasion, during the siege of Sarajevo, Bosnia was under an arms embargo by the UN. While the Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats were aided by troops and arms arriving from Serbia and Croatia, as they were not subject to the arms embargo, Bosniaks, who were the victims of the aggression, were not given a chance to defend themselves. They fought under an arms embargo and defended Sarajevo for 1,425 days, the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare. Sarajevo never fell. The army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina turned the tide of the war in a way that no one expected. The resistance was legendary. The question is, why was it necessary? Why is it that Bosniaks were left alone to fight a war for 3 years that eventually resulted in genocide? Here is one perspective that was presented to the United States Congress in 1995, and I quote, "I respectfully suggest, were it not Muslims this time who were in the rape camps, were it not Muslims who are being exterminated as part of this new phrase, ethnic cleansing, that the world would have behaved differently," end quote. These are the words of then Senator, now President Joseph R. Biden. Then Senator Biden further elaborated that the reason why 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust was because they were Jews. The world turned a blind eye, just as they were doing in Bosnia. He shortly after goes on to say something that is chillingly foretelling. "Let me be presumptuous enough," and this is a quote, "to go on a little more to what I think the next history lesson will be. The Soviet Empire has collapsed. Good news. The bad news is that all of the ethnic hatred, all of the ethnic fighting, all of the atrocities that occurred 100 years ago and 40 years ago are now uncovered again. There are 25 million Russians living outside the border of Russia, in the Ukraine, in the Baltic countries, in Kazakhstan. There's a war in Armenia, in Georgia, and almost all of it is based on ethnicity," end quote. Then Senator Biden goes on to say that unless the United States steps in and helps Bosnia, that this is the start of the collapse of the Western alliance and that it will spread war in Europe in the next decade. He was very pessimistic about Europe because in his opinion, quote, "there is no moral center in Europe," end quote. What is the cause of this lack of moral center in Europe? Why is it that so many generations have seen persecution on European soil driven by ethnicity? In order to understand the future of multiculturalism in Europe, I think we need to reflect on some of its past. Bosnia was a multi-confessional and multi-ethnic country that embraced diversity centuries ago. There are many examples of this throughout Bosnia's history, going back 1,000 years. I will only share a few with you today to try to paint a picture of Bosnia's struggle for diversity and multiculturalism and Europe's resistance. The first example I wanted to share has to do with the events which unfolded following the issuance of the Alhambra Decree in Spain in 1492, when the Catholic monarchs of Spain ordered the expulsion of practicing Jews from its territory. At the time, Bosnia was a self-governing province of the Ottoman Empire, which did not discriminate against the Jewish people. Bosnia became a safe haven for the Sephardi Jews, who to this day live in Bosnia and have a rich 500-year-old history. Similarly, a large Roma population has lived in Bosnia for over 600 years. With all this diversity, there are not a lot of places in this world like Sarajevo, a city that is often called Jerusalem Pico, or Little Jerusalem. It is one of the most multicultural cities in Europe where you can see a Catholic church, an Orthodox church, a mosque, and a synagogue within blocks of each other. Wandering through Sarajevo's old town, the city's history and multiculturalism are evident in its architecture. It's like walking through time. The city is a living example of tolerance. How is it then that a country that has always been proud of its diversity, ethnic and confessional, had a genocide committed against its Bosniak Muslim majority in recent history? Could it be that multiculturalism and diversity are seen as a threat in Europe? Was the attack on Bosnia in the 90s a symptom which signaled the spread of nationalism around the world today? Even within Ukraine, there are far-right groups rising that are threatening to further destabilize the country. Ukraine's foreign minister and defense minister have both said that the greatest risk the country faces is internal destabilization under the threat of a Russian invasion. The risk came into focus last fall when President Zelensky accused Democratic Acts, one of dozens of right-wing groups that represent a potent political force in Ukraine, of planning an armed protest in Kiev's Independence Square as part of a coup plot. All the while, Europe is dealing with an influx of refugees from the Middle East. The fabric of European society is changing, and it's changing fast. This is a recipe for a rise in tensions and a fear of the other. Factions within Europe, whose popularity has increased over the recent years, are using fear and othering to express concerns their culture is disappearing, which explains the election of far-right politicians across the continent. One of them being Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who stated last December, I quote, I am doing my best to convince Europe's great leaders that the Balkans may be further away from them than from Hungary, but how we manage the security of a state in which 2 million Muslims live is a key issue for their security too, end quote. The state he was referring to was Bosnia, of course. This resulted in many Bosniak leaders denouncing Prime Minister for what they consider to be Islamophobic and racist statements. Interestingly, when we really think about it, Prime Minister Orban's argument falls apart at the outset. The people of Bosnia have lived where they are today since the last ice age. They are not invaders or someone to be feared. Before the Ottoman invasion, they referred to themselves as Bosniaks and were originally made up of people who followed Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and the Church of Bosnia, which was labeled as heretical by the other two. In the 14th century, we saw the arrival of the Ottoman Empire and a wide acceptance of Islam in the region, followed by the arrival of the Roma people. In the 15th century, we saw the arrival of Jewish migrants who found a home in Bosnia. Yet Orban chose to use the term Muslim, as if to erase the rich multicultural history of Bosnia that all Bosniaks are proud of. Even when Bosniaks were discriminated against, persecuted, expelled, and systematically exterminated, they did not go avenging all the blood that was shed. Even though over 600 mosques were intentionally destroyed by the aggressor during the war, the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina did not destroy a single church. I believe it is clear what the threat is when the facts are considered. Given its history of sheltering those in need, which is elaborate, Bosnia has been and still is Europe's long-lost moral center. While Middle Eastern refugees are being shoved into slums around Europe and are seen as a threat to the current world order, Bosnians see their arrival as a test of humanity. Time and time again, locals provided shelter and food to those in need. Once again, Bosnia is rising to the challenge, despite the political and economic crisis it is in, to be a shelter for the oppressed and to stand on the right side of history, without regard to the religion, ethnicity, or race of those arriving at their doorstep. Europe's treatment of Ukraine refugees, on the other hand, has been very different from that of those coming from the Middle East. Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed with open arms in Europe as brothers and sisters, and rightfully so. But we have to ask ourselves why the treatment of Ukrainian refugees is so different from those coming from the Middle East. One group is majority Christian, the other majority Muslim. One group is mostly white, the other is mostly North African and Middle Eastern. Although, did you know in the US Census, there's no way for a person from the Middle East to identify other than white? A problem of identity erasure in and of itself that Middle Eastern communities are trying to raise awareness around. It would appear that Europe's discriminatory treatment comes down to religious, cultural, and racial bias. This would explain the rise of far-right nationalism around Europe. We see history repeating over and over. The symptoms are the same. Those who are different are labeled as the other. The use of terms them and us, which leads us to discrimination and eventually dehumanization. Once a group is viewed as no longer equal, it is easy to persecute and exterminate them because the majority has been desensitized to their suffering. This is happening to brown and black people and to Muslims around the world today. We've seen it at our own doorstep, evident in the Black Lives Matter movement. How can we be optimistic about the future of multiculturalism in Europe when we are grappling with systemic racism in our own country? What is it that we are so afraid of? These are questions each of us needs to answer for ourselves, and we need to do it fast. There will come a time when we will be asked to choose a side in this battle that is being led around the world today. We need to ensure that we stand on the right side of history, and in order to do that, we need to elect leaders who will move the world forward, past Islamophobia, past anti-Semitism, past racism and hate. Unless the people of Europe fight with all their might for a democratic and free Europe, I fear that we will see another global conflict, and I cannot imagine the devastation that would follow. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, Selma, thank you so much for finishing us off. Now, we do have actually a lot of questions, so we'll try to get through this and start right away. So the first question is for Orel from Zachary. He asks, what do you think will happen to the field of Ukrainian studies after 2022? After 2014, there was a major shift in the tone and tenor of Western analysis of the country. Will we start speaking of Ukraine as we do now of Bosnia as a story strictly of violence and tension?
I think there are two options. One of them, I think I will also refer her to some of Yevhenii's comments. One of the things we'll need to know is how will our access to archives look like? Just in so many ways, the ability of writing Bosnian history, for example, is limited not only because so many people are drawn just to the war, but also because of various archival mishaps, accidents, and tragedy that happened over the years, right? I remember when I was inquiring one day about some archival hints I followed from an old monograph, the archivist told me, well, what do you want? Nazis used them for heating in the Second World War. But to answer your question, usually there are two scripts for this, assuming that we can resume and do work as before. It's very possible that people will not be drawn to speak of Ukraine only in terms of war and violence, but also will start seeking out the days before this, not the immediate ones, but they will start going back to the time when everything was actually good and nice and working. This happens now everywhere in imperial studies, not so much British imperial studies, but let's say so many people who work on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the Ottoman Empire, are actually not working on their breakup anymore, but they work on the peaceful time before nationalism come and ruined it for everybody. So I see that this line of thought can be just as enriched by the war.
Yeah, I see Yevhenii has his hand raised, so I'll let you speak now.
Yeah, this was one of the points I forgot to mention. That's for me as a person who just started to return to academia to do proper historical research. This is basically mean that archives are gone for some time. Not to say that for most of the Ukrainian scholars, Russian archives were gone for ideological reasons. Not to mention that Russian archives weren't accessible for the last decade, and it was getting worse and worse. But in general, I believe that's the whole situation with around Ukrainian studies will only cherish but it will be mostly from what I see already directed sociology, social anthropology, and other social sciences. With history, so to say, historians for most part of it are like a pathologanatoms. They mostly working with critical cases or dead bodies. It has to be enough of time distance to actually study something. But I think if because, like, for instance, we in Chernihiv, in northern part of Ukraine, we have archive of the KGB being burned just because of the shelling. So we have some losses there. So, but I believe that some studies regarding the earlier parts of the Ukrainian history maybe get more attention in the recent future, in coming future.
All right, now we have one question from Sarah for Selma. I wonder if the history of the ongoing persecution of the Roma people is one way to compare the histories of Bosnia and Ukraine. Do you think advocates for the Roma in Sarajevo and Bosnia could offer support or advice for their Ukrainian counterparts? After all, in Bosnia, a Roma person technically cannot become president.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a great question. Not only a Roma person, but also a Jewish person cannot become a president in Bosnia. And it is a huge problem. And it is a problem that the Bosnian people are actually trying to fight to resolve, as there have been multiple court decisions made by the European Court of Human Rights that have called the current constitution of Bosnia discriminatory, and that it violates multiple human rights laws. And so this is something Bosnians are aware of. Unfortunately, the Dayton is currently in place as it is. It was very effective in ending the war in Bosnia, not so effective in being a true democracy, if you will, which is something that Bosnians have been fighting for and have always had democratic values. I do think that the activists for the Roma population in Bosnia definitely can share valuable lessons to what's happening to the people of Ukraine. And I know there have been messages and letters and videos of Bosnians and others in the political sphere and the religious sphere that have been sent to the Ukrainian people to just show support, to show understanding, and to even give advice, because we've just been through this, 3 decades ago. That is not very long. And here we are again, even though we keep saying never again. So I hope that answered the question.
All right, thank you, Selma. So we have another question for Orel now. In a place like Hungary, how will horizontal polarization end? In other words, will we see something similar to Russia, where the left liberal opposition, not unlike ethnic minority populations, find themselves permanently sidelined?
I was muted. The day before the election, some of my friends all of them are leftists, middle class, educated, from Budapest, said, tomorrow Orban's last day in office is going to be, and then we're going to win. We're going to win by a landslide. And even if Orban is going to win by a very small margin, we're going to emigrate out of Hungary. Now, of course, none of them would emigrate out of Hungary. They will soon discover, or they would soon discover, that no one is waiting for them outside of Hungary. But the problem of this social differentiation is not unique just to Hungary. You can see this in many countries, including my own native Israel, which really makes, I think, all over the region, and I don't mean here region in the geographical sense, more like in the sociological, political sense, it makes governance extremely difficult. It makes the setup of new governments post-elections almost impossible. It makes every government increasingly fragile, because eventually, this is the case in Serbia, in Israel, in Hungary, you can see how, if given the chance, the people, the educated left middle class leaning of Budapest, of Tel Aviv, of Belgrade, shares so much more in common than, let's say, people who live in some of the smaller towns of Hungary, Serbia, and Israel. And what we can see here actually is the price we pay, speaking of multiculturalism, for, in many respects, nation states. In some countries, some events made nationalism stronger, seem more natural, cross social classes easily. In others, we see here how, just like in the old imperial period, let's say, urban dwellers seem to agree more with urban dwellers on many topics. So how we deal with it, I think, is impossible. It is for me, because I am a historian who is still, everything after 1968 seems like the future to me. But it is one of the long-term prices we pay for choosing nation states. And I will say, by the way, that I'm not saying here that living under empire was better. We just pay different prices back then than we pay now.
All right, now we have another question for Yevhenii. How much collective memory is there among Ukrainians in the eastern regions of the shift to the Russian language a few decades ago as a marker of higher status? Does it serve to strengthen Ukrainian identity to a greater extent compared to other contexts of linguistic adaptation?
The thing with the Donbas and the identity of the people there, this was under severe pressure of forging since early 20s. So the Donbas was always presented by the Soviet propaganda as a heart of the proletariat movement. So this was the emblematic proletarian region, the place where all the workers are there. Like then only after that in 30s, the Ural will appear and Kuzbas will appear as the additional workers concentration regions. In my earlier studies, I was actually, while I've been there and after I fled Luhansk, I've been studying actually the workers' movement and propaganda representation, because like Soviet government was trying to hide the actual reaction of the workers on the establishment of the Soviet rule, and workers weren't happy. In 1927, only in Luhansk there were 3 factories which went on lockdown because of the strikes going on. So basically, transition into other linguistic realm was crippling and happened really fast after Second World War, because of the change of the population there. Jewish population was perished, and new population, mostly from the central Russia, was poured into region to rebuild the industry, mostly partially destroyed by the Soviet government, partially destroyed by Nazis, and partially evacuated to Ural. So the memory of this transition never been pressing, because it was in Soviet times it was presented as a regular adaptation of the representation of the workers' movement, which is like Russian speaking, very prominent, very active, and like all of this storm work was one of the parts of the myth of the Donbas. In fact, it wasn't the case since 60s, and industry in Donbas was extensive since 70s. Now, and this is what problem nobody was facing, and only economic historians found out about this only in recent decades or so, when archives of the industrial bodies started to be available. So basically, this combination of the factors, from one side the migration after Second World War, and crippling Russification, which was happening, actually erased from the generation of 70s and 80s the memory that there were Ukrainian language is prevalent language. Because, for instance, my grandmother, who was studying in Luhansk University right after Second World War, she was used to Ukrainian speaker, and Ukrainian was prevalent language. My mother in 70s was already studying in same universities, but in Russian. So it never been an issue, and language and like bilingualism never been an issue, as Orel described. And that's the switch between languages was something about norm. And if you go out from the big city in Donbas, you will always hear the phenomenon we call surzik, so the mixture of Ukrainian and Russian language, which is very local in different regions of Ukraine, and you can hear all kinds of variations of those. So like, I would not say that it was a present issue. It was actually one of the variations of norm, and nobody was actually addressing this as a ideological or even cultural issue.
All right, we have another question for Selma now, and that is, do you think Bosnia and Kosovo should join NATO for their own safety?
That is a great question, and extremely relevant in Bosnia and Bosnian politics today. Absolutely. I do think that both Bosnia and Kosovo need to join NATO because of the threat that is literally at their front door. Unfortunately, we have heard the threats from Russia that if Bosnia were to join NATO, that there would be repercussions, that we see what's happening in Ukraine, and that they cannot promise that the same would not happen in Bosnia. This was the ambassador of Russia in Bih in Bosnia that actually said this in an interview. So when you have threats like that, it is very difficult not to think, okay, we need to be part of NATO because then we get this protection, especially given our experience during the war and the fact that we had an embargo on weapons during the war, and here you are again at the verge of war, and there's just this fear among people that this could happen again. Obviously, it's happening in Ukraine, and it keeps happening again. So, and there's a huge amount of genocide denial that we are fighting in Bosnia from the side of Bosnian Serbs who celebrate war criminals as heroes and deny that what happened in Srebrenica actually happened, even though we have judgments by the European Court of Human Rights that were fact-based, science-based judgments. This is not stuff that was just made up. So not only are we fighting genocide denial, we're fighting threats from Russia, from Serbia through Kremlin, right? And we have no way to defend ourselves yet again. So absolutely, NATO is a crucial part of protecting the Balkans.
All right, so given the time, I think we have enough for one last question. And this is for Orel and for everyone. So the part that's for Orel is that you mentioned that Putin is a fanatic that idolizes Russian culture at the expense of others. I would compare this to the cult of Milosevic, which made the breakup of Yugoslavia possible. But that does not exclude Serbian culpability. Do you think that the difference you saw in Bosnian cafes might now and in the future arrive in the cafes in Ukraine? Russian might not be so welcome a language waiters speak after the war.
Now, I will start by saying that the change in Ukraine was very rapid. I remember the first few days when I was volunteering at the main train station in Budapest, I was joined by some American students who graduated with their degrees in Slavic studies. And one of them was telling me, you cannot speak Russian to them. And I speak Ukrainian, I speak both Ukrainian and Russian, but some of the families who came did not speak good Ukrainian and preferred speaking Russian. And you could see here how, let's say, the American students were more enthusiastic about phasing Russian off than were the Ukrainians, but now it's almost universal. Now, some of my Ukrainian friends, who would speak to me before the war only in Russian because the Ukrainian was not their most comfortable language anyway, would now tell me, they would now move to write Ukrainian with me, and they would tell me, if I get orthography wrong, please let me know. I need to get my Ukrainian straight, which was something, I guess, that was not on their to-do list before the war. Now, as to the Milosevic thing, in the historiography of Yugoslavia, we are kind of used to having discussions about the role or the denial of Bosnian nationhood that began long before the 1980s, about the war, the space given to each of the nationalities in the republics, and Serbians trying to make Yugoslavia greater Serbia on the expense of Croatia, Bosnia, and so on. So what I'm saying here is that for someone who studies Yugoslavia, seeing Milosevic is not that radical. The war crimes were radical. The discourse that was genocidal was radical, but the kind of the upbuilding of the crisis was not so radical to most of us who are familiar with 20th century Yugoslavia. This was the history of Yugoslavia basically from the days it was just a kingdom. In the case of Ukraine, the reason why so many of us are kind of weirded out by takes like by famous Ukrainian philosophers like Volodymyr Yermolenko and others is that it was not there until not so long ago. It was American historians who dug most of the dirt, if you want, about Russian Ukrainians not coexisting in the late imperial period. When we read about Ukrainians and Russians before the war, there was not this sense that the entire 20th century history was one in which Russia was trying to build itself on the presumed grave of Ukraine. Of course, all of these things were there, and there are many Ukrainian historians who focused on these tensions and the banning of Ukrainian language that happened. But this was not the entirety of the historiography. almost everything we know about Yugoslavia for the entire 20th century is the history of Serbian hegemony. Whether you look at this from Croatia and then the attempts of Croatian politicians to kind of make sure that Yugoslavia is not going to become Serbian Empire 2.0, or whether you skip to the 1980s and you look at Kosovo and Bosnia. So what I'm saying here is that I hope not, because it is going to be very difficult. It is still today very difficult to speak about Yugoslav history, which is not under the title of preparing for genocide. I hope that Ukrainian history, even before the war, after we make all the necessary lessons about our engagement with Russia as a state and as a society, we will still be able to speak about all of these great topics that make Ukrainian history so vibrant, and not reduce it to the history of two nations preparing for a horrible, horrible war.
I guess Yevhenii, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I would add here that's I believe that's after this war we will actually see more of what's Orel is afraid of seeing. Well, the national core of the historiography will be more built into idea of Ukrainians striving against the will of Russians. Though as a historian of early Soviet Union, my take on before 24th of February and actually still was always that Ukrainians helped to build this both of the empires, and usually was on the forefront of the executors, both executors of terror and executors of the great achievements. It always been like that. We have an anecdote which sounds better in Russian and Ukrainian. That's that there are three periods in the Russian history. It's before pre-Peter the Great, after the Peter the Great, and Dnipro-Peter history. So Dnipropetrovsk, it's a old name of the city of Dnipro, because well, it's a joke about the late Soviet Union basically ruled by people from Ukraine. It has to be evidential and important also from my point of view as a historian, for all Ukrainians to remember that we are also responsible for this. We're responsible for all the good and bad things in both empires, not just being mere victims of Russian imperialism or whatever. After all, Ukraine as a political nation, first as idea of nation was structured in 19th century Russian Empire, was created and codified. I would say that. Yeah, but unfortunately, we will see more of, or fortunately, I didn't know how it would be better, but we will see more of the juxtaposition of Ukrainian history against Russian history for generations, and talk about role of Ukraine in those empires would be maybe as a role of dismantling of those empires. On the linguistic side, I don't think that's Russian language will perish from Ukrainian realm. My take was always that there should be a Ukrainian Russian language codified and built into structure of Ukrainian culture, and not let Russia to appropriate the language which is part of the Belarusian culture, Georgian culture, Kazakh culture, and I believe every part of the former empire has its right on its culture in the Russian language.
Thank you so much for finishing us off, Yevhenii. I'm really sorry for everyone who still has questions, but we're past time right now. But I do want to give a really heartfelt message to everyone who came out to this forum today, especially the speakers, the panelists, some of whom had to deal with unique time zone constraints. So huge thanks to everyone who showed up today. I hope this was informative and entertaining at the same time. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your days.